Hey everybody, Nick from TriRig here. Today I want to talk an idea that keeps making the rounds in popular forums and in the minds of a lot of people generally. You hear it stated in different ways, but the most common version is something like this. We are at peak aero. Bikes and equipment all perform generally at the same level, and as long as you're on something reasonably modern, there's no difference in terms of aerodynamics. This idea has been around for a very long time. Let's go back 11 years to the 2014 Ironman World Championship race. I bumped into the legendary Mark Allen, 6-time race winner, and talked to him about that year's race. His opinion, even at that time, was that while technology does evolve, it's essentially evened out in the pro ranks, and he tended to discount differences in the field as far as position, aerodynamics, and bike setups go.
I mean, the technology is, it's important to keep yourself kind of in the game. You know, if your bike is heavy and it's not aero and you're not in a good position, obviously you're not going to be able to race at your peak. However, you know, everybody gets that dialed in, so then the playing field ends up being evened out again.
And with all due respect to Mr. Allen, I could not disagree more on that point. Even at the time, it was obvious how much equipment can play a role in race day performance. Just a couple years prior, Craig Alexander had gone from a disappointing 4th place to a record-setting victory after making significant changes in equipment, upgrading to a much more aerodynamic frame, adding an aerodynamic helmet tested to work with his position, improving his bottle placement and nutrition strategy. It all added up to a monumental aerodynamic improvement and ultimately his 3rd Kona title in 2011. Now, you might argue, well, that was then, this is now, all the bikes are great, right? Okay, let's fast forward a little bit to 2017 and talk about a comparative wind tunnel study spearheaded by a group of folks who frequent the Slow Twitch forums. They tested a number of frames with a rider on board, and while you might want to say you would have conducted the test differently or pick apart their protocol, what's interesting to me is that there was a 10-watt delta between their fastest result and their slowest one. 10 watts. And if you even go out a little bit in the yaw angles to something like 10, you get more like 20, 25 watts of difference between the frames. And that's just the frame set being changed. Hydration, position, rider, wheels, tires were all kept as constant as they could, given that there was a mix of rim brake and disc braking frames involved. But what blew my mind is that folks looked at that 10-watt delta and declared, we're at peak aero. Frames don't matter anymore. Contrast that with a previous conversation I've had with Andy Potts, a veteran of our sport with more race wins than most and several Kona top 10 results. Andy told me that during an entire year of training, during his peak years of performance, he would be delighted if he saw 2 or 3 watts of improvement in terms of his power output. Try telling him you're going to either add or subtract 10 watts from his frame and that you consider it to be irrelevant, and see what his response will be to that. So, okay, that's still a few years ago. Now it's 2025. Does equipment still matter, or have we finally hit peak aero? Sadly, I think we might have retreated a little bit from what was the high watermark in terms of purely aerodynamic design. In the effort to put everyone on disc brakes, manufacturers have all become a little bit more opaque in terms of aerodynamic data. No one wants to admit that their 2025 disc brake frame is 3 watts slower than the 2019 rim braking version. But even taking frames and brakes out of the mix, there is still so much daylight in terms of aerodynamic improvements to be found, and equipment is a big part of that. At the pointy end of the sport, the top brands and the top athletes spend a lot of time on aerodynamic testing. This testing focuses on a combination of the athlete's position and the equipment, and it's ultimately about 2 different but related stories. The first story is how the air flows around the athlete-bike complex. Everything tends to affect everything else. So one choice at the front of the bike can have downstream effects further back. A position change can affect how everything works together, and a helmet that was bad for one position might now be great for your new position. This is especially true for helmets that flare out to fare the shoulders, like the POC Tempor or the Giro Aerohead Mark II. These kinds of helmets tend to work only if the position is right, and then in those cases, they're usually the best helmets from an aero perspective. Position is, of course, about 80% of the aero equation, and improvements there can yield much bigger gains than improvements to equipment alone. But ultimately, the question we have to ask is whether the equipment you're using is helpful in achieving that beneficial change to your position, or whether that equipment is an obstacle to that change. The second story in aero testing is about how the actual use of your equipment affects the aero equation. How easy is it to get to a water bottle? Is your arm going to hang out in the wind for 5 seconds every time you drink, or can it be a straw right below your mouth? Can you see your computer without having to tip your helmet up into the wind? How often do you need to break Aero to get to an aid station because you only kept a limited supply of nutrition on board? And those questions are at the core of Tri-Rig's design philosophy. Everything we make is designed both to be hidden from the wind, adding the least amount of drag possible, while enabling the broadest possible range of experimentation to your position, so that the complete bike rider complex is as integrated and elegant as it can be. Our Alpha Aero bars are the quintessential example of this phenomenon, allowing you to make a position change in 30 seconds, which might take 3 hours on traditional equipment. Our newest product, the BTA Elevator, is another prime example. We aren't at peak Aero because athletes are still experimenting and finding gains in all sorts of areas: position, nutrition strategies, how, when, and why front hydration setups can make you faster. Just look at the 2024 World Championship race compared to even a couple years prior, and you'll see a world of difference in position, hydration choices, helmet choice, and how equipment plays a role in all of it. I know it's pretty rich of me, the seller and designer of Aero equipment, to claim that it's still an evolving discipline. But you don't have to look far to see evidence for it. I always roll my eyes pretty hard when I hear about peak Aero because it just doesn't conform to reality. It's true that athletes win races, not equipment. But ask Sam Laidlow or Patrick Lange if they'd rather ride with today's equipment or the gear which was declared peak Aero even 5 years ago, and I think we all know what they'd say. The sport continues to evolve. It's not a coincidence that athletes with the resources to test equipment changes all seem to want to do so. It's because those changes matter. That's going to be all for today. I'd love to hear your take on this topic in the comments. Do you feel like you've hit peak Aero for yourself? Do you think there are no stones left unturned? Or like me, do you think there is always a new horizon in this sport? And that's part of what makes it so exciting and fascinating for all of us who are interested in the details. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.